There is a kind of stillness that has nothing to do with peace. It lives in the space between one breath and the next, in the pause before a decision that has already been made but not yet admitted. Nora Hale had been living inside that stillness for so long that she had stopped noticing it, the way a person stops hearing the clock on the wall after the first few hours, the way water stops feeling cold once the body has given up fighting it. She was washing her hands at the basin of a roadside stopping station when she became aware of what she was doing. Not just washing, but washing the way she had been trained, the way that had been drilled into her through years of standing beside beds and basins and bowls of water that always needed to be clean. 3 passes over the knuckles. Thumbs last. The motion so familiar it had outlasted everything else. The job, the house on the Eastern Road, the man who had stood in the doorway of their bedroom and said the thing he said, and then left before she had finished crying. She looked down at her hands under the water. They were clean. They had been clean before she started. The voice that came over her then was not her own. It was something older, something that lived underneath language. It said, "You are still doing this. You are still going through the motions." And she dried her hands on the rough cotton towel hanging from the nail beside the basin, and she picked up her bag, and she walked back out to the wagon that was waiting. She had bought a ticket to the furthest point on the route. That was the only plan she had. When the driver called out Redstone Crossing and she looked out at the dust and the weathered storefronts and the street that ran one direction and then stopped, she counted the coins remaining in her small purse. There were not enough for the next leg. She did not feel relieved or disappointed. She felt nothing in particular, which had become its own kind of feeling. She stepped down from the wagon into the late afternoon light. The town was small in the way that frontier towns were small, not cramped but sparse, as though the buildings had been placed with generous distance between them, and then the people had simply never arrived to fill the gaps. There was a general store with a porch that ran the length of the front wall. There was a feed merchant. There was a building with no sign whose windows had cloth tacked over them from the inside. There was a long, low structure at the far end of the street that might have been a meeting hall or a church. It was hard to say. And there, in the middle of the block, separated from its neighbors by 10 feet of empty ground on either side, as though space had been deliberately left around it, was a building with a painted sign above the door. The paint had faded. The lettering was still legible if you looked directly at it. The door was closed. The windows on either side of it were dark. Nora looked at the building for a moment longer than she had looked at anything else on the street. There was something about a closed door in the middle of the day that pulled at the eye, something that asked a question without forming the words. She turned away and walked toward the general store. The woman behind the counter was perhaps 60, perhaps more, with the kind of face that had been shaped by years of looking directly at things and deciding what she thought about them without waiting for someone else's opinion. Her hair was silver and pulled back with the efficiency of someone who had stopped thinking about her hair a long time ago. Her eyes were the color of creek water over dark stone, clear and slightly cold, until you looked long enough to see that the cold was just the surface. She looked at Nora the way Nora had already grown used to being looked at in the months since everything had changed. The look that started at the bag and worked its way up, that took in the practical dress and the careful posture, and the expression that revealed nothing because there was nothing left to reveal. "Ruth Avery," she said. Her voice was direct without being unkind. She did not offer her hand, but she set down the bolt of cloth she had been measuring and gave Nora her full attention, which was its own form of welcome. Nora told her her name, told her she needed a room for a few nights, possibly longer. Ruth looked at her for another moment, the kind of look that was doing arithmetic behind the eyes, and then she nodded once and came around the counter. The room she showed her was at the back of the building, past the storeroom and the dry goods, and a small kitchen that smelled of bread and wood smoke. It was not large. It had a window that faced the alley between the store and the building next door. A bed with a quilt that had been washed so many times the pattern had gone soft and indistinct, and a small table beside the window with a stub of candle on it. Nora set her bag down on the floor and looked around and felt, for the first time in months, that the size of a space matched the size of what she was carrying. She paid a week in advance. Ruth took the money without comment and then paused at the door. "You don't look like someone who came for the scenery," she said. Nora looked at the window. The alley outside was narrow, just a strip of packed earth between two walls, no scenery to speak of. "No," she said. Ruth looked at her a moment longer, the arithmetic again. Then she said something that Nora did not expect. She said it the way someone states a fact about the weather, plainly, without drama. The way you tell someone it will rain tomorrow so they know to bring a coat. She said, "He used to be the reason people weren't afraid to get sick out here." Nora waited. Ruth didn't explain who she meant. She just nodded once, the way people nod when they've said what they came to say, and left. Nora stood in the small room for a long time after that. She went out in the early evening when the light had dropped to something more forgiving, that particular gold that softened everything it touched and made even the empty lots look like they were waiting for something instead of abandoned by it. She walked the length of the main street once, taking inventory without meaning to. It was the habit of someone trained to assess, to walk into a room and note the exits, the available supplies, the condition of the people inside. The town was not sick exactly, but it was diminished. She could feel it in the way a few people sat on their porches without talking, in the way a woman carrying a basket moved a little faster past the closed building in the middle of the block, as though she didn't want to slow down and think too long about what was behind that door. Nora stopped in front of it. Up close, the sign was clearer. She had been right about what it said. A physician's shingle, simple and direct, with a name she noted and then held lightly in her mind without letting it settle too firmly. The door was solid, no gaps around the frame, nothing escaping from inside. But there was a window on the near side of the door, and when she looked at it from the right angle, she could see that the glass was not dusty on the inside the way it would have been if the room had been truly abandoned. Someone had been breathing air in there recently. Someone had been keeping the inside clean even if they were not opening the door. There was a piece of paper tacked beside the door frame. It had been there long enough that the edges had curled. She stepped close enough to read it. The handwriting was cramped and effortful. The handwriting of someone not accustomed to writing in public. Someone who had stood at this door for a while before deciding to leave something behind. It said, "Does anyone know who can treat a fever?" No punctuation, no signature, just the question, hanging there like a thing that had been said into an empty room and never answered. Nora stood in front of that piece of paper for longer than she had stood in front of anything in a very long time. She went back to her room. She sat on the edge of the bed in the dark and did not light the candle. She listened to the town settle into its nighttime sounds, The low wind, the distant sound of a horse shifting in a stall, the creak of the store above her as the temperature dropped and the wood contracted. She thought about the paper on the door. She thought about the woman who had said what she said, and then left without explaining it. She thought about her hands at the basin, going through motions so old they had become involuntary. She thought about her bag, which she had not fully unpacked, which she had set on the floor instead of on the table, which was the bag of someone who was not sure yet whether they were staying. She did not think about the other things. She had gotten good at not thinking about them. In the morning, she went back to Ruth's counter for breakfast, and Ruth made coffee and eggs without being asked and set them down without ceremony, and they sat across from each other in the quiet of the early hour without filling it with unnecessary words. Nora thought that this was something she had not experienced in longer than she could calculate, the company of someone who did not require her to perform being fine. She was partway through the eggs when she saw him. He came into her line of sight through the store window, passing on the near side of the street. Tall, moving with the deliberate economy of someone who had learned long ago not to waste effort. His coat was dark and worn at the elbows. His hat was pulled down against the morning light. He was carrying nothing and going, as far as she could tell, nowhere in particular, or perhaps somewhere very specific and simply not hurrying to get there. He passed the closed door of his own building without looking at it. That was the thing she noticed. Not the looking, but the not looking. The way you don't look at something you are aware of every moment. The way you keep your eyes forward when you pass the room where something happened. Because looking is not the same as not thinking about it. He was gone around the corner before she could form a complete thought about what she had seen. Ruth had been watching her. When Nora turned back to the table, Ruth was looking at her coffee cup, but the set of her mouth said she had seen exactly what Nora had been watching. "He has his reasons," Ruth said. She said it the way you say something when you have said it before, when you have worn the path smooth and know exactly where it leads. Nora said nothing. She finished her coffee. She spent the morning walking. She was not doing anything useful. She knew that. She was simply moving because stillness had started to feel like a choice she was making, rather than a condition she was in. And she was not ready to choose it consciously. She walked past the feed merchant and the meeting hall. She walked past a small house with a kitchen garden that was doing its determined best against the dry soil. She circled back and walked past the physician's door again. There were 2 more pieces of paper on the door now. Someone had added them since yesterday. She did not step close enough to read them, but she could see that they were more of the same, more questions left in the absence of answers. She was standing there, a few paces back, when the door of the general store opened behind her. She turned. The man from the window was standing on the store porch. He must have come in through the back. He was looking at her with the direct, uncomfortable attention of someone who has decided to say something and is following through before they lose the nerve. He said, "You were at the Johnston house last night." It was not a question. She understood then that in a small town like this, most things were not questions. She said, "The little girl had a high fever. There was no one else." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she had seen before and had learned to read accurately. It was not coldness. It was not hostility. It was the look of someone standing at a window they cannot bring themselves to open, watching the air on the other side. She met his eyes and did not look away, and did not press him. He said, "You have medical training." She said, "I was a nurse for 11 years." He said, "Was," she said. I stopped. Something shifted in his face at that word, something that recognized itself in her answer the way a stone recognizes water, not warmly, but accurately. He nodded once. He went back inside the store without another word. Nora stood on the street and breathed in and breathed out. In the afternoon, Magistrate Orrin Draft found her. She was on the bench outside the feed merchant, mending a tear in the strap of her bag, when he came along the street with the particular walk of a man who has decided where he is going and rehearsed what he will say. He was not old, perhaps 55, with a face that had been handsome long enough that the habit of handsomeness remained in the way he held himself, in the expectation behind his eyes. He wore his authority the way some men wore their good coat, not for warmth, but to be seen wearing it. He introduced himself pleasantly. He knew her name before she gave it, and she noted this without letting the noting show. He asked about her journey, about her plans, about what had brought her to Redstone Crossing. He asked the questions of someone who already had the answers and was checking her against them. She answered carefully, giving him what was true without giving him more than he had asked for. She had learned in the years of being a nurse in places where people made decisions about other people's lives that the space between what someone asks and what they actually want to know is always worth measuring. He mentioned the physician. He mentioned it lightly, in passing, as though it were simply the natural next topic after a stranger had been seen helping at a sick child's bedside. He said, what a shame it was. What a loss for the community. He said he had been working on a solution, that Redstone Crossing deserved proper care, that good people were doing what they could. She watched him talk. She watched the way his sentences moved, where they started and where they arrived, the shape of what they were constructing. And she thought, this man knew she was here before he came to find her. He had already decided something about her. He was here to see whether his decision was right. When he left, she sat for a while with the mended strap in her hands. The evening came in shades of copper and rose. She ate supper in Ruth's kitchen and helped with the washing up, and Ruth let her help without making a fuss about it, which was another form of grace. Afterward, they sat with their coffee and the lamp between them, and Ruth said, without being asked, that Orrin Draft had been magistrate for 9 years and had the kind of ambition that looked like civic duty until you watched it long enough. Nora asked how long the physician's door had been closed. 8 months, Ruth said. She set it into her coffee cup quietly, the way you say a number that still surprises you even after you've said it many times. 8 months is a long time, Nora said. Ruth looked up at her. Yes, she said. It is. She paused. He still takes his supply orders. Every month, regular as rain. The medicines come in on the supply wagon. He collects them. He takes them inside. She shook her head slowly. 8 months of medicines sitting in a locked room. He won't throw them away, but he can't bring himself to use them. Nora held her coffee cup in both hands and did not say anything. She went to bed early that night, but not to sleep. She lay on the quilt in the dark and looked at the ceiling and listened to the town outside the window. Wind through the gap between buildings. A door closing somewhere down the street. And then, faint enough that she might have imagined it, the sound of footsteps crossing a plank floor inside a building that was supposed to be empty. She turned her head toward the window. The alley outside was dark. but through the narrow gap between the store and the building beside it, she could see, if she looked at exactly the right angle, a thin line of yellow light. Someone was awake in the closed building. Someone was in there in the dark, with the door locked and the medicines on the shelves, and the lamp burning because they could not sleep either. Nora pressed one hand flat against the quilt beside her. She thought about the piece of paper on the door. Does anyone know who can treat a fever? She thought about 11 years of training that lived in her hands, whether she wanted it to or not. She thought about the man at the window who had said, "was." She understood, in the particular way that one wounded thing recognizes another, that the word he had heard in her answer was the same word he carried about himself. Was. The light in the gap between the buildings burned on. She watched it until her eyes grew heavy, and in the moment before sleep took her, she did not feel the stillness that had followed her across all those miles of road. She felt instead something she had almost forgotten the shape of. Not hope exactly. Something earlier than hope. The thing that comes before it, that has not yet learned to be afraid of being wrong. She closed her eyes. Outside, the wind moved through Redstone Crossing, and the light in the narrow gap burned steady and quiet, like something that had not yet decided whether to go out. The morning arrived the way mornings did in that part of the world, not gently, but all at once, the light coming over the eastern ridge like a decision that had already been made. Nora was awake before it. She had been awake for some time, lying on the quilt with her hands folded across her stomach, listening to the store above her come alive with small sounds, the creak of the floorboards, the scrape of a chair, the particular silence that meant Ruth was already at the stove. She washed her face in the basin. She looked at herself in the small mirror on the wall, which was something she had not done with any real attention in a long while. The face that looked back at her was not a face she disliked. It was simply a face that had been through something and had not yet decided what it was going to look like on the other side. She went upstairs and had coffee, and did not say much, and Ruth did not require her to. By the time she stepped out onto the main street, the town was beginning its morning in the unhurried way of a place that had learned not to expect too much from any given day. A man was loading a cart outside the feed merchant. Two women were talking at the far end of the street, their voices too low to carry. A dog was doing nothing in the shade of the porch across the road, with the particular contentment of an animal that has no appointments to keep. Nora walked. She was not going anywhere specific. She was doing what she had found herself doing since she arrived, moving through the space of the town the way a hand moves over a surface it is trying to understand, slowly, with attention. She passed the physician's door without stopping, but she looked at it. There were 3 pieces of paper on it now. Someone had added one overnight. She kept walking. At the end of the street, she turned back and walked the other direction, past the general store and past the meeting hall and out to the edge of town where the road became a track and the track became a suggestion, and the land opened up into the long, dry expanse that surrounded Redstone Crossing on all sides. She stood there for a few minutes. The wind moved through the grass in the low places, slow and continuous, like breathing. She thought about 11 years, about the weight of that number, which was not the weight of years in a calendar, but the weight of everything that had happened inside them. The beds and the basins, the families sitting in chairs outside rooms they were not allowed to enter, the particular grammar of crisis, which she had learned so thoroughly that it had become her first language, The language she thought in, even when she was not at work, even at supper, even in the middle of the night when someone shifted beside her and she woke already calculating what she might need. She had been good at it. That was the part no one talked about when things fell apart. How good she had been at it. How much of herself she had poured into being good at it. And then what it meant when the thing you had poured yourself into could not hold what it was given. She turned and walked back. The Johnston house was on a side lane off the main street, a modest place with a vegetable patch and a hen house, and the general look of a home that was cared for by people who worked hard and had learned to make do. The little girl was on the porch when Nora came by, sitting in a square of morning sun with a cloth doll across her lap. Her color was better. The fever had broken sometime in the early hours, the way fevers did when they were ready to go, reluctantly and all at once. The girl looked up at her with the uncomplicated curiosity of a child who had not yet learned to pretend not to stare. "You smell like lavender," the girl said. "The bag," Nora said. She held it up slightly, the worn leather satchel with its particular scent of dried herbs and old leather and something underneath that was simply itself. Something in it. She paused. "How do you feel?" "Better," the girl said. She considered this. "My throat still hurts a little." "That will pass today," Nora said. The girl nodded as though this were an acceptable arrangement and went back to her doll. Nora walked on. She was at the well at the center of the street, drawing water, when she became aware that she was not alone. She did not hear him approach. He moved quietly for a large man, but she felt the change in the air the way you feel a cloud pass over the sun, not seeing it, but registering the shift in temperature. She continued drawing the water. She did not turn around until she had finished. Cormac Aldridge was standing a few feet away with an empty bucket in each hand, waiting his turn with the simple patience of someone who had been raised to wait his turn. In the morning light, he was clearer to her than he had been through the store window or in the passage of the street. He was older than she had first thought. Or perhaps he had simply been through enough that the years showed differently. His face was the face of someone who had spent a long time outdoors and a long time thinking, both of which left their own particular marks. He stepped up to the well when she moved aside. He worked the handle with the efficiency of habit, not watching what his hands were doing. She should have walked on. She did not. She said, "The girl on the Johnston porch. Her fever broke last night." He kept working the handle. "Yes," he said. She looked at him. "You knew." He glanced at her briefly. "Ruth talks." Nora said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "There are 3 pieces of paper on your door now." He did not respond to that. He filled the first bucket, set it aside, began filling the second. The water came up clear and cold, and made a sound against the bucket that was one of the cleanest sounds in the world. When he had both buckets full, he straightened and picked them up and looked at her directly for the first time. His eyes were a particular shade of gray that was not cold, but was not warm either. Something in between. Something that was waiting to be one or the other depending on what it was given. He said, "Where did you train?" She told him. He nodded once, the same nod as before, the one that meant he was filing the information away without deciding yet what to do with it. She said, "I stopped 3 years before I came here." He looked at her with that same quality of attention that she had noticed before, the kind that did not require her to explain herself further, but made clear that it had heard everything. He picked up his buckets. He walked away. She stood by the well for a moment after he was gone. There was something exhausting about a conversation with someone who said so little, and something, underneath the exhaustion, that was almost a relief. She had spent so long in the company of people who filled every silence that she had forgotten that silence was a valid form of speech. The morning moved on. She helped Ruth in the store, carrying bolts of cloth down from the high shelves, restocking the dry goods, doing the small, useful things that filled the hours without demanding too much. Ruth did not ask her to help. She simply made room for it, shifted slightly to one side, and allowed Nora to be useful, which was its own form of generosity. In the afternoon, Orrin Draft came in for his weekly provisions. He was pleasant to Nora in the way he had been the day before, warm and careful, and slightly too aware of her presence for someone who was simply shopping. He asked how she was settling in. He asked if she had found the town to her liking. He asked these questions with his back partly turned, selecting items from the shelf, which was the posture of someone who wanted the answers without appearing to want them. She gave him the same careful attention she had given him the day before, the same measured truth. She watched his sentences and where they arrived. When he left, Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then she said, without looking up from the ledger she was working on, "He sat on the town council for 4 years before he became magistrate. He is very good at knowing what he wants before he asks for it." Nora set a bolt of cloth on the shelf. She said, "What does he want?" Ruth turned a page in the ledger. "He has been in correspondence with a physician from up east for the better part of a year. Man named Felton. Younger, ambitious, looking for a place to establish himself." Ruth smoothed the page. "Orrin has been very helpful in describing the opportunity here, the building, the equipment, the established community." Nora said, "The building belongs to Cormac." "It does," Ruth said, "for now." She did not say anything else, but the two words sat in the air between them with a weight that was entirely out of proportion to their size. That evening, Nora took a longer walk than usual, out past the edge of town in the direction of the ridge, where the light went last. She walked until she could not hear the town behind her, and there was only the wind and the grass and the first stars appearing in the pale sky. She stood in that open space and breathed in and breathed out, and she tried to feel the emptiness the way she had felt it for months, that particular numbness that had become its own comfort. It was harder to find than it used to be. She was heading back when she saw the boy. He was perhaps 10 years old, sitting on the flat rock at the edge of the track with his knees pulled up and his arms around them. He was not crying, but his eyes had the swollen look of someone who had been. He looked up at her approach with the expression of a child who has been trying very hard to appear as though he does not need anything. Nora slowed. She did not immediately ask what was wrong, because she had learned a long time ago that asking that question directly of someone who did not want to admit they needed help was the fastest way to make them close. She simply stopped nearby and looked out at the ridge and said, "The light lasts a long time out here." The boy said nothing. She said, "I used to try to watch the exact moment when the sun finished setting. You can never catch it. It's one way, and then it's another way, and you never see it change." The boy shifted slightly on the rock. "His mother," he said. He said it like someone pulling a splinter, quick and pained. "She's been sick since Tuesday, and Pa doesn't know what to do." Nora turned to look at him. "What kind of sick?" she said. He described the symptoms in the halting way of a child who has been paying close attention to something frightening and does not have the vocabulary for all of it. Nora listened carefully. She knew what she was hearing. She had heard it before. She said, "Take me to her." He looked at her with the complicated expression of someone who wants to be helped, but has been told enough times that help is not always available that they have stopped fully believing in it. Then he got off the rock and led her back toward town. The house was on the far side of the main street, larger than the Johnston place, but with the same look of people doing their careful best. The father was a big man gone quiet with worry, the kind of quiet that is louder than noise. He let her in without asking who she was, which told her everything she needed to know about how frightened he was. The woman in the bed was in her mid-30s, pale in the wrong way, with a fever that had been climbing for 2 days, and a cough that had settled into the chest with the kind of solidity that Nora did not like. She worked through what she had in her bag, which was less than she would have wanted. The herbs she had, the knowledge she had. She did what she could, and it was not nothing. But she was aware, with a clarity that had not dulled with the years away from the work, that this was a situation where her limits were showing. She stayed for 2 hours. By the time she left, the woman was more comfortable, the fever slightly reduced, the cough easier. The father walked her to the door and looked at her with the helpless gratitude of someone who has been given a partial answer when they needed a complete one. She walked back toward the general store in the dark. She stopped in front of the physician's door without deciding to stop there. She stood in the street and looked at it. The piece of paper from the night before was still there. The 2 that had been added were still there. The line of yellow light she had seen from the alley window might or might not be burning behind the closed shutters. She could not tell from here. She stood there for a long time. She was still standing there when she became aware, with the particular awareness that comes from being watched by someone who is not trying to hide it, that she was not alone on the street. She turned. He was standing on the far side, a few doors down, with his hands in his coat pockets. He had clearly been going somewhere, and had stopped. He was looking at her with that quality of attention that she had come to recognize as his particular form of presence. Steady and undemanding and entirely focused. She said, "There is a woman on the far side of the street. Chest involvement. 2 days of climbing fever." She paused. "I have done what I can with what I carry." He said nothing. She said, "I am not asking you for anything." She meant it. She was not asking. She was simply telling him what she had found. The way you tell someone about weather you have walked through. Not because you expect them to change it, but because it seemed important to say. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the door behind her, the door with the pieces of paper on it. He said, "Come back in the morning, 7 o'clock." She waited for more. There was no more. He walked on down the street and turned the corner and was gone. Nora stood in the dark street with the warm air around her and the pieces of paper on the door behind her and the sound of the town settling into sleep, and she tried to understand what had just happened. She was not sure she could. She understood the words. She understood the time he had given. What she did not fully understand was what it had cost him to say them, but she thought she had some idea, the way you have some idea of the weight of something by the effort it takes to lift it. She went back to her room. She sat on the bed in the dark and did not light the candle. She thought about a woman with a climbing fever 2 streets over and a man who had not opened his door in 8 months, who had just told her to come back at 7 in the morning. She thought about the first day she had walked into a hospital ward as a trainee, the particular smell of the place, the sounds, the strange combination of urgency and routine. She thought about what it had felt like to be useful in a way that mattered. She had not let herself think about that in a long time, because thinking about it led somewhere she had been trying not to go. She unclasped her bag and set it open on the table. She looked at what was inside: the folded cloths, the small glass bottles of tincture, the dried herbs wrapped in paper and labeled in her mother's handwriting, because it had been her mother's bag before it was hers, her mother's careful script that she had not been able to bring herself to replace with her own even after all the years. She touched one of the paper parcels lightly. The paper was soft with age. The herb inside still held its scent, faint but present, the way things do when they have been properly kept. She closed the bag. She undressed in the dark and lay down and looked at the ceiling. The town was quiet. The wind had dropped. Somewhere a long way off, something moved through the grass at the edge of town, some nighttime animal going about its business with no awareness at all of the particular weight of what was happening in this small place, the particular moment that was collecting itself like weather on the horizon. She thought about 7 o'clock. She thought about a door that might open. She closed her eyes, and for the first time since she had arrived in Redstone Crossing, sleep came without the long wait. In the morning, she woke at 6 and dressed without hurrying. She went upstairs and had coffee, standing at the counter because she was too restless to sit. Ruth watched her from across the room with the expression of someone who has seen this particular variety of restlessness before and has the good sense not to comment on it. Nora was at the door of the physician's building at 5 minutes to 7. The street was quiet in the early morning. The light was flat and clean. The pieces of paper on the door moved slightly in the small wind. She stood a few feet back and waited. At 1 minute past 7, the door opened. He had been there since before 6. She knew this because the lamp inside was already warm, the way lamps are when they have been lit long enough to stop smelling of fresh oil and become simply light. He stepped back from the door in a way that was not quite an invitation, but was not a barrier either. It was an opening. She walked through it. The room was nothing like she had expected, and exactly like she should have expected. Clean. Ordered. Every surface clear. Every instrument in its place. The supply shelves along the far wall fully stocked in the careful way of someone who had been maintaining a readiness they were not using. She walked through it slowly without being asked to, taking it in the way she took in every new space, with attention and without judgment. The coffee on the stove was already made. He poured 2 cups without asking, and set one near the edge of the work table without placing it directly in her hand. She picked it up. They stood on opposite sides of the room and drank their coffee and did not say anything for a while, and it was not uncomfortable. It was the quiet of 2 people who were both accustomed to silence and had not yet decided how much of it to give up. He said, "The woman on the far side of the street." She told him what she had found. She was precise, organized, the way she had been trained to be, symptoms and duration and what she had observed and what she had done. He listened without interrupting, and the quality of his listening was the quality of someone who understood exactly what she was saying and was already thinking 3 moves ahead. He said, "We should go now." She set down her coffee cup. He picked up his coat and his bag, the old leather bag that had been his father's and was now his. She would learn that later, the strap repaired twice in places that still showed the stitching. He moved toward the door. Their hands were close together for a moment as they both reached for the door frame at the same time. Not touching, just close. She felt the proximity of it without looking at it. She stepped through the door first, and he followed, pulling it shut behind them, and they walked together down the quiet morning street toward a woman who needed help, not talking, not needing to, moving with the particular rhythm of two people who were, without quite knowing it yet, beginning to learn each other. Behind them, the door of the physician's building stood closed, but it was no longer locked. The days that followed had a different quality than the days before them. Not easier, not lighter, but different in the way that weather is different once a front has moved through. The air changed, the pressure shifted, everything the same, and nothing quite the same. Nora came at 7 each morning. Cormac was always there before her. The coffee was always already made, always left near the edge of the work table in the same place, the same distance from the edge, a detail so consistent that she eventually understood it was not habit, but intention. He had decided where to put it, and he put it there. They worked without discussion of the arrangement because there was no arrangement, not formally, not in any way that had been named or agreed upon. There was simply the door that was no longer locked and the 7 o'clock that had been said once and never needed to be said again. The people of Redstone Crossing found out the way people in small towns find things out, not through announcement, but through the gradual accumulation of evidence. A light in the window before most households were awake. 2 figures walking the street together with the purposeful movement of people going somewhere that mattered. The word passed from porch to porch and kitchen to kitchen, careful and slightly wondering, the way people talk about something they are afraid to believe too fully in case it stops being true. Cormac worked the way she had guessed he would, with a precision that was not coldness, but concentration. Every movement deliberate, nothing wasted. She watched his hands and understood within the first 2 days that whatever had happened to him in the months he had kept the door closed, it had not happened to his skill. His skill was intact, complete, living in his hands the way knowledge lives when it has been deeply enough learned, below the level of thought, below the level of choice. What had been injured was somewhere else entirely. She watched the way he did not ask patients their names first. She had noticed this that very first morning with the woman on the far side of the street, how he had asked her age, her symptoms, how long, what she had taken. The name came later, after he knew what was wrong and had formed a plan, as though he needed the clinical distance of the problem first before he could afford to know the person. She understood it before she could have articulated it. She had her own version of the same thing. On the 4th morning, she opened the wrong drawer looking for the folded cloths and found it before she knew what she was looking at. A silver stethoscope, older than the others on the instrument tray, with a patina on the chest piece that came from years of hands, not from neglect. It lay in the drawer alone, on a square of dark cloth, the way you keep something that matters without wanting to see it. Every time you open the drawer, it's in. She looked at it for a moment. She closed the drawer. She found the cloths in the next drawer and said nothing about it, and he said nothing about it, and they went on with the morning. But she thought about it. She thought about it the way you think about something that has told you more than it meant to. The week built itself around their working hours, and in the hours outside of them, something else was building, slower and less defined, the way structures build underground before they are visible at the surface. They ate at the same time in different places, she at Ruth's table and he at his own. But sometimes the timing overlapped, and she would come into the store to find him finishing his coffee at the counter and Ruth refilling it without being asked. And he would look up and nod, and she would sit at the other end of the counter, and they would exist in the same space for 20 minutes without it being awkward, which was itself a kind of intimacy neither of them had decided to have. He asked her questions sometimes. Not personal questions, not at first. Practical questions, clinical questions, questions that were really assessments of how she thought, how she approached a problem, what she had seen and what she had done about it. She answered the way she had learned to answer people who were really asking something else, directly, without deflection, giving him the truth and letting him decide what to do with it. One afternoon, she asked him why he never asked a patient's name before their symptoms. He was silent long enough that she thought he might not answer. He was sorting through the supply shelves, checking quantities against a list in his head that she had come to understand was always running. He said without turning around, "Names make people real before you know what's wrong. If you know what's wrong first, you can think clearly. If you know the name first, you feel everything before you have the information to do anything about it." She thought about that. She said, "And when you know what's wrong?" He turned then. He looked at her with those gray eyes that were still waiting to be one thing or another. "Then you can afford to know who they are," he said. She held his gaze for a moment. She understood that he was not only talking about patients. The town settled into them the way towns settle into things that have decided to stay. The woman on the far side of the street recovered fully over the course of the week and came to the building herself to say so, a thing she did standing in the doorway with the formality of someone delivering an important message, which Nora supposed she was. An older man with a long-standing problem in his knee came for the first time in many months, his wife beside him with the expression of someone who had been waiting for permission. Children were brought in with the routine complaints of children. Each person who came in added something to the room, some small particle of ordinary life that settled on the surfaces and became part of the atmosphere. Cormac was different with each of them. Not in a way most people would notice, but she noticed because she had spent enough time watching people to see the fine gradations. With the elderly, he was slower, quieter, asking the same question in different ways until he was sure he understood. With children, he said less and showed more, demonstrating on himself what he was about to do before he did it. With the frightened ones, and there were always frightened ones, he simply stayed in front of them and let them look at him until the looking was enough to make the fear a little smaller. She filed all of it away without meaning to. On a Thursday evening, later than usual, they were finishing up after a difficult afternoon case when she moved to the supply shelf and found it rearranged. Not wrong, not disordered, but different from the way it had been in the morning. Someone had moved things. Someone had gone through the shelves and reordered them in a way that was more logical, more accessible, the things most frequently needed at eye level and the things rarely needed moved higher. She looked at the arrangement and recognized the thinking in it. It was the thinking of someone who had learned from experience which things you need to reach for quickly and which things you have time to find. She did not say anything about it. She put what she was carrying in its new place, but she found herself standing at the shelf a moment longer than she needed to, her hand resting lightly on the edge of it. When she turned around, he was watching her from across the room. He looked away and went back to the notes he was writing. The night that changed something came in the middle of the following week, after a long day that had begun with a child brought in before dawn and had not truly ended until well after the light had failed. The town was quiet. Most of the lamps on the main street had been extinguished. Nora was still in the building because she had been cleaning the instruments and had lost track of the hour, the kind of losing track that happens when your hands are busy and your mind is doing something you have not given it permission to do. Cormac was writing at the desk. He had been writing for some time, the scratch of the pen quiet and steady, and she had grown so accustomed to the sound of it that when it stopped, she noticed the silence before she looked up. He was looking at the closed drawer, the one with the stethoscope in it. His hands were flat on the desk, the pen set aside. His face was the face of someone sitting in a room they did not choose to be in and cannot find the door out of. She set down the cloth she was holding and said nothing, and waited. He said, "His name was Wren." She did not move. The wind came in through a gap in the shutter as he said it. She would remember that afterward, the specific quality of the silence around those 4 words, how completely still everything was except the wind in the gap. He said it the way someone says something they have said many times inside their own head, worn the shape of it smooth, but have not said aloud. And so the word comes out both practiced and raw. He said it the way people say the names of the ones they have lost when they finally allow themselves to say them to another person, the way the name carries everything attached to it, the whole weight of a life that was not long enough to have accumulated much weight at all, which somehow makes it heavier. He did not say more. He did not explain. She understood that he was not explaining. He was naming. She crossed to the chair near the window, the small wooden chair that had been pulled away from the wall and was now closer to the desk than it had been in the morning. She sat down. She did not look at him directly. She looked at the lamp between them, the way its light spread across the desk and the floor, the soft, uneven circle of it. After a while, she said, "Her name was Lily." It was the first time she had said it. Not just to him, to anyone. The name had lived inside her for long enough that she had stopped thinking of it as a word and started thinking of it as a weight, a specific kind of pressure behind the sternum that she carried without expecting it to be understood. Saying it aloud was like setting something down on a surface and hearing the sound it made when it landed. Quieter than she expected. Solid. He looked up. She felt him look up, though she was still watching the lamp. "The midwife told me she was a girl," she said. "That was what I knew. That was the sum of it." The wind moved through the gap in the shutter. The lamp between them burned without flickering. She did not feel the need to say more, and he did not ask for more. And the silence that came after was not the silence of something unfinished, but the silence of something that had been said and heard and did not require any further handling. They sat there for a long time. When she finally looked at him, he was looking at the drawer again, but differently than before. Not with the locked quality she had come to associate with that direction of his gaze. Something in it had released slightly, like a fist that has been held tight for so long that the unclenching is as much about exhaustion as it is about choice. She went back to her room that night and sat at the small table by the window and opened her mother's satchel. She took out the curated seriousness of its contents, the paper-wrapped herbs and the small glass bottles and the folded cloths, and she laid them on the table one by one. Then she took out the notebook at the bottom of the bag, the one she had not opened since she had packed it into the bag and told herself she was bringing it for reference. her mother's handwriting on the cover, the same careful script that labeled the herbs. She opened it to the first page and read the first line, and then turned to the back of the notebook and opened it to the last written page, and then passed that to the first blank page. She sat in front of that blank page for a long time. Then she closed the notebook and put everything back in the bag. But she had looked at the blank page. That was something. The morning after that night was different again. The way mornings are different after a night when something has changed that cannot be unchanged. Not dramatically different, just shifted. The coffee was in the same place. The light came through the windows at the same angle, but when she arrived and he looked up from the desk and said, "Good morning," the words landed differently than they had before, with the weight of someone who had said a name and heard a name said back, who had sat in silence together and not needed it to end. She had been there perhaps an hour when she went to the supply shelf for something and found the drawer slightly open, the one she had not touched since she had stumbled on its contents. She looked at it. She looked at the gap. She did not open it further. When she turned around, Cormac was standing in the middle of the room with the silver stethoscope in his hands. He was not putting it on, and he was not putting it away. He was holding it the way you hold something you have picked up and are not sure yet what you are going to do with. He was looking at it with an expression that was too complex to name and too private to look at directly. She turned back to the shelf and found what she had come for, and gave him the room to do what he was going to do with it. When she turned around again a few minutes later, the stethoscope was on the desk, on the surface, not in the drawer, not being worn, but visible, present, out where the light could reach it. She did not say anything. She carried what she had found to the work table and began preparing it. That afternoon, Orrin Draft came into the building for the first time. He knocked before he entered, which was a courtesy, but there was something in the knock that was not entirely a courtesy, something that said he had decided to knock rather than simply doing it. He stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands and looked at the room with the expression of a man who is doing a rapid assessment of a situation and not finding it exactly as he had arranged for it to be. He was pleasant. He was complimentary. He said what a good thing it was to see the building in use again. What a relief to the community. He looked at Nora with the same measured awareness he had been carrying since the first afternoon, and she returned his gaze with the same measured nothing that she had been giving him since then. He said nothing directly. He never did. But the sentence underneath his sentences was perfectly legible, and it said, "I see what is happening here, and I have not finished deciding what I am going to do about it." Cormac let him talk. He stood near the supply shelves with his arms crossed and let every word land in the room and settle, and did not respond to any of them in any way that could be used. Nora had watched him do this with difficult patience, absorb the difficulty without adding to it, and it was, she thought, one of the most useful skills a person could have. Orrin left. The door closed behind him. Cormac stood for a moment in the middle of the room. Then he said, without inflection, without making it a bigger statement than it was, "He has been expecting someone else to be standing here." She said, "I know." He looked at her. She looked back at him. She said, "He approached me the second day I was here, before I had done anything of particular use." Cormac's expression did not change dramatically, but something in it settled into a new configuration, a recalculating. He looked at the door where Orrin had been standing. Then he looked back at her. She said, I do not know the full shape of what he wants, but I know what he wanted me to think he wanted, and those are not the same thing." He held her gaze for a long moment. Something passed across his face that she thought might have been the first version of trust. Not the established kind, not the earned kind, but the preliminary kind. The kind that says, "I am listening to you in the way that means I might rely on this." She said, "Ruth would know more." He said, "Ruth always knows more." It was the first time she had heard anything in his voice that might have been the precursor to something lighter. Not a smile, nothing so final as that, but the shape of one, somewhere behind the words, like light behind a cloud that has not yet decided to let it through. She turned back to the work table. He turned back to his desk. The afternoon moved on around them, ordinary and not ordinary at all. The way time moves when something is happening inside it that has not yet made itself fully known. The silver stethoscope stayed on the desk. She did not draw attention to it, and neither did he. But at one point in the late afternoon, when she was at the shelf and he was seeing to a patient, she heard the particular sound of it being picked up and the other particular sound, specific and unmistakable, of the earpieces being placed. She did not turn around. She heard him say something to the patient in his low, careful voice. She heard the patient respond. She heard him say something else, something that contained the patient's name, which he had asked before the symptoms this time, or perhaps simultaneously, or perhaps the order of it had simply stopped mattering as much as it once had. She stayed where she was and looked at the shelf and felt something move in her chest that she did not immediately name. She let it move without naming it. Some things needed to be felt before they could be understood, and she was, slowly and with great caution, beginning to remember that. The community meeting was held on a Tuesday evening in the long, low building at the end of the main street that served, depending on the occasion, as a gathering hall, a place of worship, and apparently, Nora was learning, a theater for the particular kind of performance that passed for civic governance in a town this size. Ruth had told her about it the afternoon before, setting the information down on the counter between them the way she set down everything she considered important, without ceremony, without editorializing, just the facts placed where they could be picked up and examined. Orrin Draft had called it. The agenda, as far as Ruth could determine from the conversations she had overheard in the course of running a store through which most of the town passed at some point in any given week, concerned the future provision of medical care in Redstone Crossing. Ruth had paused at that point in her account and looked at Nora with the clear water eyes that never missed anything and said, "He has been building toward this for some time. Tonight he intends to arrive somewhere." Nora had not told Cormac about the meeting. She had assumed he knew, the way things were known in this town before they were said, through the particular atmosphere that gathered around events before they occurred. But when she arrived at the building that evening and found a seat near the back, and the room filled around her with the faces she had been learning over the preceding weeks, she did not see him. The chair that Ruth had saved beside her own remained empty. Ruth glanced at it once and said nothing. Orrin stood at the front of the room with the ease of a man who was accustomed to the front of rooms. He had the quality that certain people cultivate over years of standing in positions of authority, a kind of performed reasonableness, a voice that said, "I am simply presenting the facts," while the facts themselves were being arranged very carefully to arrive at a predetermined conclusion. He spoke about the town's needs. He spoke about the importance of reliable care. He spoke about continuity and community investment and the responsibility of leadership to ensure that essential services were not subject to the uncertainties of individual circumstances. He did not say Cormac's name for a long time. When he finally did, it was with the tone of someone being very fair, someone making every effort to be compassionate about a difficult situation. He said that the town had been patient. He said that patience was a virtue, but that it had limits. He said that he had been in correspondence with a physician of excellent reputation who was prepared to come to Redstone Crossing to bring fresh energy and renewed commitment, and that the arrangement he had been carefully developing would require, in the interest of establishing proper institutional footing, that the building currently associated with the provision of medical care be formally administered under the oversight of the town council. He said all of this in a voice of warm reasonableness. He said it in a way that made it sound like the only logical conclusion to a set of circumstances that had arranged themselves, regrettably, to require it. The room had the quality of a room that had been partly convinced before it arrived. Nora had seen this before, in other contexts, the particular texture of a crowd that has been worked on in smaller groups before being assembled into a larger one, each person having been given a slightly different piece of the picture, all of them adding up to the same destination. She looked around at the faces. She saw discomfort, and she saw resignation, and she saw, in a few of them, the expression of people who had not quite decided what they thought and were waiting to see what happened next. She stood up. She had not decided to stand up. Her body made the decision before her mind had finished the sentence it was forming, which was something that had happened to her very rarely in her life, and which she recognized distantly as the sign of something moving in her that had been still for a long time. The room turned toward her. Oren turned toward her with the expression of someone encountering a variable they had not included in their calculation. She did not raise her voice. She had learned long ago that a low voice in a quiet room carries further than a loud one. She said, before the council made any decisions about that building, she would like to ask a question of the people in this room. Oren said her name with a particular inflection, the inflection of a man who is trying to establish that this is not the appropriate moment, not the appropriate forum, that she does not quite have the standing to be asking questions here. She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked back at the room. She said, in the 8 months that the door of that building was closed, how many people in this room went to that door and knocked? Not to ask for something, but to ask how the man inside it was doing. The room was very quiet. She did not wait for answers. She let the question sit in the air and be what it was. She said she had counted the pieces of paper on that door. She had read them. Every one of them was a request. Not one of them was an inquiry. She paused. She let that land. She said, a man who had given this town what he had given it spent 8 months inside 4 walls, and the community's response was to leave notes asking what it needed from him. She sat down. The room had the particular silence of people who have been told something true that they did not want to hear, and who are now in the process of deciding whether to be defensive about it or to sit with it. Some of them would choose defensiveness. She knew that. Some of them were already constructing their reasons, but some of them were sitting with it, and she could see it in the way they had gone still, the way stillness looks when it is the stillness of recognition rather than resistance. Oren recovered himself with the practiced ease of someone who had been managing rooms for a long time. He said something about the importance of all perspectives being heard. He redirected. He moved the meeting forward with the efficiency of someone who knew that a room's attention is a finite resource and that the moment of disruption could be absorbed and continued past if the current was strong enough. But the current was not quite what it had been before she stood up. She could feel it in the room. Something had shifted in the weight distribution of the evening, and Oren could feel it too, though he would not show it. She did not stay until the end. She left when the meeting had moved into a procedural phase that she did not need to witness, slipping out the side door into the cool night air, and she stood on the step for a moment and breathed. She went back to her room. She did not sleep easily. The next morning, Cormac was at the building before her, as always. But when she arrived and he looked up from the desk, there was something in his face that told her he knew about the meeting. Ruth, she thought, or the walls of this town, which were thin enough to carry sound without trying. He said, "You didn't have to do that." She said, "I know." He looked at her for a moment. She looked back at him. Neither of them said anything further about it, and she understood that this was how it would be with him, that things could be acknowledged in 4 words and then set aside, not because they did not matter, but because they had been seen, and that was sufficient. They went to work. It was 3 days after the meeting when Oren Draft found her alone. She had been walking the evening road at the edge of town, the walk she took when she needed to think without being inside 4 walls. She heard him behind her before she saw him, the particular rhythm of footsteps that belonged to someone who had decided on a destination. She stopped walking and turned. He was not wearing his magistrate expression. That was the first thing she noticed. The performed reasonableness was gone, replaced by something that was not quite threatening, but was the shape of what came before a threat. The shape of a man who has decided that he has been patient long enough and is prepared to say so. He stood in the road in the last of the evening light and looked at her with the eyes of someone who has arrived at the part of the conversation he had been building toward for some time. He said, "She should understand her position here." She waited. He said, "She had been providing medical assistance in this town without the sanction of the town council." He said it the way you say something that you have been holding in reserve, something you have been keeping for when it was needed. He said that he had been aware of this since before she had done anything of use, that he had allowed it to continue because it was serving a temporary purpose, and that the nature of temporary purposes was that they ended. She looked at him. She understood the shape of what he was doing. She had understood the general shape of it for some time, and this was simply the moment when the general became specific. He said, if she were to speak to Cormac, if she were to help him understand that the arrangement the council was proposing was in everyone's best interest, the question of her own activities here would remain a question, something to be considered and overlooked in the spirit of goodwill. If she chose not to be helpful in this way, the question would need to be answered, and the answer would require her to leave. He said all of this in the reasonable voice, the fair voice, the voice that said he was simply presenting the facts. She stood in the road and let him finish. She let the silence after his last word extend long enough to be uncomfortable. Then, she said, she had heard him. She turned and walked back toward town. She did not go to the building that night. She went to her room and sat at the small table and did not light the candle for a long time. She sat in the dark and thought about the shape of the choice she was being offered, which was not really a choice, but the form that was given to something that had already been decided for her, which was the only kind of choice certain kinds of power ever offered. She thought about Cormac. She thought about what it would mean to go to him and say what Oren wanted her to say, to become the instrument of something she did not believe in, to use whatever she had built in the weeks of working beside him as a lever to move him toward a door she did not think he should walk through. She understood that she would not do it. She had understood it before she finished thinking it. Some things were not actually questions. They only wore the shape of questions. What she sat with longer was the other part, the part about what came after the not doing it. She opened her bag in the dark. She put her hands inside it and felt the familiar contents without looking at them, the paper-wrapped herbs and the small bottles and the folded cloths, and underneath all of it, the notebook with her mother's writing on the cover. She held the notebook in her lap without opening it. She thought about the blank pages at the back. She thought about the stethoscope that now lived on the desk instead of in the drawer. She thought about the name that had been said aloud and the name she had said back. She thought about the chair near the window and the coffee at the edge of the work table and the rearranged shelf and all the other things that had happened in the space between two people learning how to be in the same room. She thought about what it meant to leave all of that, and she let herself feel what it meant, fully, without the protection of the numbness that she had been carrying as though it were a necessary organ. It hurt. That was the thing. It hurt in a way that meant it had mattered. And she had spent long enough trying not to let things matter that the feeling, for all its pain, had a quality of proof to it. Proof that something in her was still capable of being affected by things. That the woman who had washed her hands at the basin out of habit and felt nothing particular about it was not the whole of who she was. She sat with that for a long time. In the morning, the sickness came. The first reports reached the building by mid-morning, brought by a farmer who had ridden in from the western edge of the valley. His 3 children had woken with fever and a rash spreading up from the wrists. He described it in the flat, careful voice of a frightened man trying to present information accurately. Cormac asked 3 questions. He looked at Nora. She looked at him. They both understood what they were hearing. They spent the rest of the morning preparing. It was not rash fever in the catastrophic sense, not the variety that moved through populations like fire through dry grass. But it was serious, and it was moving, and 3 children at the western edge meant there were likely more they had not yet heard about. Cormac moved through the supply shelves with the quiet urgency of someone doing a calculation in his head that he does not want to say aloud. Nora prepared what could be prepared. They did not talk much. There was not a great deal to say that was not already being communicated through the work itself. The second family arrived in the early afternoon. 2 children, similar presentation. Then a third, a single child, 8 years old, whose mother carried her in with the particular careful terror of a parent who has been frightened long enough to have gone past the crying stage into something quieter and more absolute. The child's name was Clara. Cormac asked it first this time, before the symptoms. Clara was the worst of them. The fever was higher, the rash more advanced, and she had a quality of stillness that was not the stillness of sleep, but the stillness of a body that had been working very hard for a long time and was beginning to tire. Nora recognized it. She had recognized it before, in other beds, in other rooms, and she knew what it meant, and what it did not yet mean, and what the distance was between those 2 things. They worked. There was nothing else. The hours contracted around the work the way hours do when the work is the only thing that exists, and the afternoon became evening without either of them registering the transition except as a change in the quality of the light through the windows. At some point, Nora became aware that her hands were trembling, not badly, not visibly to anyone else, but she could feel it. A fine vibration in the fingers that she recognized as the body's response to sustained effort and suppressed fear. She pressed them flat against the work table for a moment when Cormac's back was turned and felt the solid surface under her palms and breathed. Clara's fever peaked in the early evening. It peaked and hung there, suspended at the top of its arc, neither climbing nor falling, and the room was very quiet except for the child's breathing and the small sounds of the two of them moving around her. Cormac sat down on the low stool beside the bed and took the child's hand in both of his. He did not do anything with the hand. He simply held it. He sat in the posture of someone who has done everything that can be done and has arrived at the part that cannot be done, only waded through. His shoulders had the shape of something very heavy being carried without complaint. Nora stood behind him. She looked at the back of his head, the dark hair that needed cutting, the line of his neck, the set of his shoulders. She thought about the drawer and the stethoscope and the name said in the dark. She thought about 8 months and what they had cost. And she thought about what it meant to watch this man sit beside this child and hold her hand and refuse to leave her in the dark. She crossed to the small wooden chair against the wall, the one she had moved closer to the desk over the weeks, and she carried it to the other side of the bed. She sat down. She looked at the child's face. She was quiet in the way that she had learned over the weeks of working beside him, was the kind of quiet that meant presence rather than absence, that said, "I am here, and I am not leaving." The fever broke at some point in the night. It broke the way fevers break, reluctantly and all at once, the heat going out of the child's skin, and the color returning, and the breathing changing from the labored shallowness of illness to the deeper, slower rhythm of real sleep. Cormac sat back on the stool. He did not say anything for a while. Then he put his face in his hands. Not dramatically. Just the gesture of a man at the end of something, setting down a weight he has been carrying for long enough that the setting down required its own kind of effort. The tears came quietly. She could see them in the lamplight when he lifted his head, tracking through the exhaustion on his face, and she thought of all the other times in this building, in other buildings, when someone had cried and she had offered the clinical comfort of someone trained to manage distress from a professional distance. She did not offer that. She sat across from him in the chair she had carried over, and she was simply there, in the way she had learned to be there, the way that asked nothing and required nothing, and simply occupied the same air as another person without making that occupation into a demand. The way she had wished, in the long months of her own worst time, that someone had known how to be there for her. He looked at her. His eyes were red with tiredness, and with the other thing, and he looked at her the way people look at someone when they have stopped trying to appear to be any particular way. She looked back at him. The lamp burned between them. The child breathed. Outside, the night was deep and still. The door of the building opened then, and Orrin Draft stepped inside with 2 members of the town council behind him and a piece of paper in his hand. He took in the scene with the rapid assessment of a man who processes everything through the lens of what it means for his position. The child in the bed. Cormac on the stool. Nora in the chair. The evidence of hours of work on every surface. He set the paper on the nearest clear surface and said with a reasonable voice that this was the formal notification requiring her to vacate her current activities and her room at the store premises within 3 days, pending the council's review of her authorization to provide any form of medical assistance within the town's jurisdiction. He said it as one says something that is very unfortunate but very necessary. Cormac stood up from the stool. He stood up with the slowness of someone who has been sitting for a long time, and with the deliberateness of someone who has decided something. He looked at Oren with an expression that was entirely without drama and entirely without compromise. He said, "Get out of this room." His voice was quiet. It was the quietness of something that has been decided before the words were formed. The quietness of a man who is not performing the statement, but simply making it. Oren said something about jurisdiction and appropriate procedure. Cormac looked at him. "There is a sick child in this bed," he said. "You are going to leave this room." The 3 men looked at one another. Then they looked at the child. Then Oren picked up his paper from the surface where he had placed it and walked out, and the other 2 followed, and the door closed. Cormac stood in the middle of the room for a moment after they left. Then he turned and looked at Nora. She had not moved from the chair. She was looking at the piece of paper Oren had left behind. She knew what was in it. She had known what was coming since the evening on the road when Oren had said what he had said with the reasonable voice. She had spent the intervening days understanding the shape of the choice she had not been given and making her own choice in the space beside it. She picked up the paper. She read it. She set it down. She looked at Cormac. He was watching her with the expression of a man who has just understood something, the expression of someone who is assembling pieces they had individually but had not put together, and the picture that is forming is not the one they expected. She could see him understanding it. She did not look away. She said, "I need to tell you something about Oren and about why he came to find me on my 2nd day here." He was very still. She told him. She told him clearly, and without managing the way he received it, without softening the edges to make it easier. She told him what Oren had said on the road about authorization and about leaving, and she told him what Oren had asked her to do with whatever she had built here, how it was supposed to be used. She told him that she had not done it and had not been going to do it, and she told him that she was telling him now because he deserved to know all of it, not the version of it that she could have given him that would have made her look better inside it. When she finished, the room was very quiet. Cormac looked at her for a long time. She could not read all of what was in his face, but she could read some of it, the part that was working through the information and the part that was working through something else, something that was not about the information at all, but about the person delivering it and the way she had chosen to deliver it. He said, "Why are you telling me this now?" She said, "Because I am leaving tomorrow and I wanted you to know the full picture before I went." The word left a particular shape in the air between them. He said, "Leaving." She said, it was her choice. She said it carefully so that he would understand the distinction, not because of Oren's paper, because of her, because she had things to do that she had not done, things that had been waiting for her to be capable of doing them. She was not running away from this place. She was, for what felt like the first time in a very long time, choosing where she was going. She stood up from the chair. She looked at the child sleeping in the bed and at the room around her, the ordered shelves and the work table and the lamp on the desk, all of it familiar in a way it had not been when she first walked through the door. She looked at him. She said, "Good night." She walked out into the dark. Before the gray came into the sky, she rose and dressed and walked back to the building in the dark one more time. She retrieved her travel bag from the work table where she had left it. The notebook she left where it was, open to the page she had written on, the words facing up toward the ceiling. The bag was hers to carry forward. The words were his to find. In her room, she sat on the edge of the bed and held the bag in her lap for a moment without opening it. Then she lay down on the quilt in the dark and looked at the ceiling and thought about tomorrow, not with dread, but with something she had not felt in the direction of the future in a very long time. A thing that was not quite certainty, but was the feeling of a person who has made a decision that belongs to them, that was made freely, and is standing on the ground of it. She closed her eyes. Outside the window, the night was deep and still, and in the building down the street, a lamp burned on a desk beside an open notebook and a silver stethoscope, and the words on the page faced up toward the ceiling, waiting for the morning. The morning came in gray and quiet, the kind of morning that withholds its light for a while as though it has not yet decided what kind of day it intends to be. Nora was dressed before the first color reached the eastern ridge. She sat on the edge of the bed with her hands in her lap and looked at the bag on the table, and she felt the weight of it as a familiar thing, the weight of everything it had always carried, and everything she was beginning to add to it. She went upstairs. Ruth was already at the stove. She did not look up when Nora came in, but she set a second cup on the counter with the unhurried certainty of someone who had known this was coming and had decided how to meet it. The coffee was strong and hot, and Nora held the cup in both hands the way she always did and looked at the window and the gray light coming through it. Ruth said, still not looking up, "You could stay." Nora said, "I know." Ruth turned then. She looked at her with the clear water eyes that had been reading her since the first afternoon, and whatever she found in Nora's face, she seemed to accept it, the way Ruth accepted most things, without requiring them to be different from what they were. She said, "Are you going somewhere, or away from something?" Nora thought about the question. She said, "I think this is the first time in a long time that those are not the same answer." Ruth held her gaze for a moment. Then she turned back to the stove and said nothing more about it, which was its own form of blessing. And Nora drank her coffee in the gray morning quiet and felt the particular texture of a decision that had been made freely and was being stood in without flinching. She washed her cup and dried it and set it on the shelf where it lived. She carried her bag downstairs and out the back door and around to the front of the store, and she stood on the porch in the early morning air that smelled of dust and the night's brief coolness before the day burned it off. The street was empty. The light was beginning to find its way over the ridge now, touching the rooftops first, then the upper windows, then the porch railings, and the packed earth of the road. She looked at the physician's building down the street. The lamp in the window was still lit, or lit again. It was impossible to know which. The door was closed, but it had the quality, even from here, of a door that was closed by choice, rather than by the absence of anyone inside. She thought about what she had left on the desk. The notebook open to the page she had written on. She had not written much. She had not needed to write much. The words were there, and they would be seen, or they would not. And she had written them because they were true, and because she had decided, somewhere in the long night before this morning, that truth was not something she could keep leaving on shelves for later. She shifted her bag to her other hand. The sound of footsteps on the far end of the street reached her before she turned to look. She recognized the pace of them, the deliberate rhythm that was not hurrying but was also not wandering, the stride of a man who had decided where he was going and was going there. She did not turn right away. She stood and looked at the ridge where the light was spreading and let the footsteps come to her. He stopped a few feet from the porch steps. He was wearing his coat, the dark one with the worn elbows, and he was carrying something in his right hand. She turned then and looked at him. He was holding the notebook, not open, not displayed, just held at his side with the particular grip of someone who has picked something up and is not sure yet what to do with it, except that they are not going to put it back down. She stepped off the porch. They stood in the street in the early morning light, the two of them, with the empty road around them and the sound of the town beginning to wake somewhere behind the walls of its houses, the small domestic sounds of ordinary life resuming itself. He held the notebook out to her. She looked at it. She did not take it. She said, "I left it for you." He said, "I know." He paused. "I read it." She waited. He looked down at the notebook in his hand. She watched him finding the words, the process of it visible in the slight tension of his jaw, the way his eyes moved to a middle distance, and then came back to her. She had watched him find words before, in the weeks of working beside him, and she had learned that the search was always worth the wait, that what came out of it had been weighed and was meant. He said, "You wrote that you had been going through the motions for so long that the motions had stopped meaning anything, that you came here because you had run out of distance, and not because you had found a direction." She said, "Yes." He said, "And then you wrote that something in this place had reminded you that you once had a direction of your own. Before everything else, before the years of doing what was needed and being what was required, you wrote that you could feel it again, faintly, like something you had left in a room a long time ago and had just found the door to." His voice on the last sentence had a quality she recognized from the night they had said names aloud in the dark, the quality of someone speaking with the careful fullness of someone who is saying a thing and feeling it at the same time. She said, "I meant it." He looked at her. He said, "I know you meant it. That is not why I am here." She waited. He said, "I am here because I read what you wrote and I realized something." He paused. He looked at the notebook. 8 months. I spent 8 months in that building going through the motions of a different kind, keeping the supplies ordered, keeping the instruments clean, keeping everything ready for a version of myself that I could not locate. He stopped. She did not fill the silence. He said, "You walked in and you set your bag on the table, and you worked, and you did not ask me to explain myself, and you did not try to fix what was wrong, and you did not pretend it wasn't wrong." He looked up at her. "You sat in the chair on the other side of the bed." He said it simply, the way you say something that has become the image for something much larger than itself, the way a single detail can carry the weight of everything surrounding it. She felt the weight of it. He said, "I am not asking you to stay." He said it clearly, not as a withdrawal, but as a precise statement of what he meant. "I know you have to go, and I know why you have to go, and I think you should go and do the things you need to do." He paused. "I am asking you, before you go, to tell me whether what is in this notebook is only about direction, or whether it is also about here." The word "here" was careful. It was not small. It was a word doing a great deal of work with very few letters. She looked at him in the morning light, which had come fully over the ridge now and was falling on both of them, warm and without ambiguity. She looked at the worn elbows of his coat and the dark circles that the long night had left under his eyes, and the notebook in his hand that he had read in the small hours, and then walked out into the morning carrying. She said, "You know what it is also about." He held her gaze. He said, "I wanted to hear it." She understood that. She understood why it mattered to hear a thing said, why the saying of it was different from the knowing of it, why certain things had to be spoken aloud in order to become real in the way that made them possible to hold on to. She had learned that in the dark with the lamp between them and a name said for the first time to another person. She said, "It is also about here." He nodded. Once. The nod that meant he had heard it, and it had settled somewhere in him that would keep it. Then he held the notebook out to her again, and this time she took it. She held it in both hands and felt the familiar weight of it, her mother's writing on the cover and her own writing inside it now, the pages that had been blank for so long and were no longer entirely blank. She looked at it for a moment. Then she looked at him. She said, "I will come back." He said, "I know." She said, "I mean it as a fact, not as a comfort." He said, "I know that too." There was a pause that was not uncomfortable. The morning moved around them, the light spreading and the town continuing to wake, a door opening somewhere down the street, a horse making a sound in a stable, the ordinary texture of a day beginning. Ruth appeared on the store porch and looked at the two of them standing in the street and went back inside without a word, which was, Nora thought, exactly the right response to exactly this moment. She shifted her bag on her shoulder. She looked at him one more time. She said, "The shelf on the left, the second row from the bottom." She paused. "You moved the willow bark to the back last week. It should be in the front. You use it more than you think you do." Something moved in his face. Not quite the smile she had glimpsed before, but closer to it than anything else she had seen. The nearest thing to it that his face knew how to make. He said, "I will move it." She walked. She did not look back. Not because she was afraid that looking back would weaken her, but because she did not need to look back. She knew what was behind her. She knew the quality of what she was walking away from with the intention of returning to, and the knowing of it was something she carried with her as she walked, in the same way she carried the notebook in her hand and the bag on her shoulder, present and real and accounted for. The road out of Redstone Crossing was dry and straight for the first mile, and then curved left and followed the low ridge before descending to the wider track that would take her where she needed to go. She walked it slowly, not from reluctance, but from the particular attention she found herself giving to things now. The way the morning light lay on the dry grass, the way the ridge looked against the pale sky, the way the town behind her was a sound before it became a silence. She thought about what she needed to do. The list was not long, but it was specific. There were things left unfinished that she had been leaving unfinished because finishing them would require her to stand in rooms she had been avoiding and say words she had been not saying and make decisions she had been postponing under the guise of not being ready. She understood now, in the clear light of this particular morning, that readiness was not a state you arrived at. It was a choice you made with the materials you had, which were never the perfect materials, which were always the imperfect materials you actually possessed. She thought about her mother's notebook and the blank pages that were no longer blank, and she thought about what she would write in the pages that came after. She thought about what she knew and what she had learned and what those two things together added up to. And she thought that they added up to more than she had been allowing herself to believe they did. The road curved. The town behind her was gone from sight. She walked on. The weeks that followed existed outside the frame of the story's main movement, the way certain essential things exist outside the frame, necessary and not required to be witnessed in full. She went where she needed to go. She stood in the rooms she had been avoiding and said the words she had not been saying. She did the hard, specific work of a person who has decided to close the distance between who they have been and who they intend to be. And it was not clean, and it was not simple, and it did not feel, in the middle of it, the way it was going to feel when it was finished. But she finished it. The day she returned to Redstone Crossing was an ordinary day in the way that certain days are ordinary in their details, and completely unlike every other day in their substance. The wagon came over the low ridge at mid-morning, and she saw the rooftops first, and then the street, and then the building in the middle of the block. The door was open. Not ajar, not half open, but fully open, standing wide, the morning air moving freely through the doorway, and a slant of light falling across the threshold into the interior. She could see the edge of the work table from here, the lamp on the desk, the shape of things that had become familiar to her arranged in the order they had found. She climbed down from the wagon before it had fully stopped, which was something she would not ordinarily have done, and which she barely noticed doing. Ruth was on the store porch before Nora reached it. She came down the steps and crossed the street and took Nora's bag from her shoulder without asking, and held it and looked at her with the clear water eyes that noticed everything. She said, "You look different." Nora said, "I feel different." Ruth looked at her for another moment, doing the arithmetic that was always running behind her eyes. Then she said, "He moved the willow bark." Nora said, "I told him to." Ruth said, "He moved it the same afternoon you left." She paused. "I know, because he came in here to tell me, which is not something he has ever done before in my recollection. He stood at that counter and drank his coffee, and mentioned it as though he were talking about the weather, and then he went back to the building, and I have been thinking about it ever since." Nora felt something in her chest that was warm and specific, and entirely without the anxiety that had attended everything she had felt for so long that she had started to think the anxiety was part of the feeling itself. It was not. This was the feeling without the anxiety, the feeling that was only itself, and it was something she recognized from so far back that it took her a moment to place it, and when she did place it, she stood very still for a second in the middle of the street. She had felt this before, a long time ago, before everything that had happened to bury it. Ruth was watching her. She said nothing, but her expression had the quality of someone watching a recognition take place and being glad of it. Nora picked up her bag from Ruth's hands. She said, "Thank you. For the room. For everything else." Ruth said, "The room is still yours if you want it." Nora looked at the building down the street with the open door. She said, "I want it." Ruth made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was in the same family. She went back inside. Nora walked down the street. She stopped in front of the open door. She looked into the room from the threshold, the way she had looked into it the very first time, taking inventory with the attention she had been trained to give to new spaces. It was the same, and it was not the same. The same ordered surfaces, the same supply shelves, the same desk, and the same lamp. But there were differences she noticed immediately. Small ones. The kind that accumulate in a place where someone has been working and continuing to pay attention. The small wooden chair was not against the wall. It had been moved to the side of the desk, close enough to be within easy reach, positioned as though it had been placed there for a specific person with a specific habit. The silver stethoscope was on the desk, not in the drawer and not put away, simply there, in the ordinary way of a tool that is in use. On the shelf where she had worked, the second row from the bottom, the willow bark was in the front. She stood in the doorway and looked at these things, and felt the weight of them, the accumulated weight of small, deliberate choices made by a person in a room when no one was watching. She stepped inside. He was at the supply shelf with his back to her, checking inventory in the way he did, methodical and thorough, the way he did everything. He did not turn around immediately, which she understood was not because he had not heard her, but because he was giving them both a moment to let the fact of her being here settle before it had to be acknowledged out loud. She set her bag on the work table. She looked around the room. He turned. He looked at her the way he had looked at things in the time she had known him, with the attention of someone who was not going to pretend to feel less than they felt or more than they knew. His face had the quality of the morning they had stood in the street, open in the particular way that had been earned rather than given. She said, "The chair." He said, "The chair." She said, "You moved it." He said, "It was in the wrong place." She looked at him. She said, "How long has it been there?" He considered this with the seriousness he gave to accurate answers. He said, "Since the day after you left." She understood what that meant. She let it mean what it meant without diminishing it. She picked up her bag and opened it and began unpacking it onto the work table, the folded cloths and the small bottles and the paper-wrapped herbs, each one placed in the order she worked with them, the order that had developed over the weeks of working here, the order that was hers and had been accommodated. She set the notebook on the corner of the desk, closed, her mother's writing facing up. She said, "I have things to tell you about where I went and what I did." She paused. "When you want to hear it." He said, "I want to hear it." She said, "Not everything at once." He said, "No, not everything at once." She felt the particular quality of that answer, the understanding in it of how things were told between people who had learned that some things needed time to become sayable, who had sat in enough silence together to know that silence was not the enemy of communication, but sometimes its best instrument. She picked up the folded cloth from the top of the pile on the work table and moved to the supply shelf and began putting things in their places, the places she knew, the places that had been waiting. She was aware of him behind her, returning to his own work, the scratch of the pen on paper, the particular sound of his attention. The morning moved on around them. The light through the windows changed as the sun climbed. From somewhere outside came the sounds of the town in its daily motion, a cart going by, voices at a distance, a child calling something to another child in the language of children playing which needed no translation. At some point, she reached for something on the shelf, and her hand was close to his for a half second. He had reached for the same thing at the same moment, not touching, just the proximity of it, the warmth of another person's hand near her own. She felt it without looking at it. She took what she had reached for and moved back to the work table. She said, not looking up, "Clara," he said, "went home 4 days ago. Fully recovered." He paused. Her mother brought a pie. Nora set down what she was holding. She looked at the desk, at the notebook on the corner of it, at the stethoscope beside it. She thought about a child's hand held in a room at the end of a long night. She thought about shoulders carrying what could not be put down until it could. She said, "That's good." He said, "Yes." The words settled in the room between them with the simple weight of something true. Orrin Draft did not leave the town in any dramatic way. He did not resign or recant or make any public accounting of what he had tried to do. He continued to attend his usual affairs and to be seen on the main street going about his business. But something had shifted in the arithmetic of the town's attention. The invisible calculation that communities are always making about who holds their confidence and who has used it carelessly. The families of the children who had recovered from the fever were talking. The families of the patients who had come back to the building were talking. The pieces of paper on the door were gone, taken down by someone, she didn't know who, because they were no longer necessary. The questions had been answered, not by a system or an arrangement or an institutional framework, but by the ordinary action of two people who knew what they were doing going to work. Orrin's physician from up east never came. Whether that was Orrin's decision or the physician's own calculation about what he was arriving into, no one could say with certainty. And Ruth, who probably knew, said only that some plans had the good sense to dissolve before they caused more damage than they had already. The town did not celebrate this. It simply continued, which was its own form of resolution, the kind that does not require a ceremony, because the thing that needed to happen had happened, and everyone could feel it. A week after Nora returned, she came into the building in the morning to find something on the corner of the desk where the notebook sat. It was small, a thing made of wood, clearly made by hand. A small square shelf, no bigger than a book, sanded smooth on every edge so that nothing about it would catch or splinter. It was the right size for a notebook and a small lamp, and not much else. It was attached to the wall at eye level from the seated position of the chair that had been moved from against the wall to beside the desk. She stood in front of it for a moment. She touched one of the smooth edges with her fingertip. She went to the work table and picked up her notebook and carried it to the small shelf and set it there. It fit the way things fit when the measurement was taken with purpose. She sat in the chair. She opened the notebook to the first blank page that remained. She picked up her pen. Behind her, she heard him come in, heard the familiar sounds of the morning beginning. The coat hung on the hook. The coffee poured. The particular quiet that was his quiet, and that she had learned over all the weeks of being in the same room with it. She began to write, not her mother's words, which had been there when she arrived and would always be there, the foundation of the thing. Her own words, in her own hand, building on top of what had been left for her and adding to it what she had learned and what she had earned and what she was still in the process of understanding. Outside the open door, Redstone Crossing went about its morning. The light was clean and fell without apology through the windows and across the floor and over the desk and the notebook and the hands that were writing in it. In a little while, the first patient of the day would come through the open door, and they would go to work, and the work would be what it had always been, and also something it had not been before. Informed by the thing that happened between two people when they learn to be in the same room with each other's silences and do not find it wanting. She wrote, He moved in the room behind her with the ease of someone who has stopped waiting and started being. The morning held them both in its clear, unhurried light, and the story continued in the only direction that any honest story can continue, forward into the ordinary, extraordinary life of people who have found their way back to themselves and to each other. Not perfectly, not without effort, but truly, which was the only way it had ever been worth doing. There is a kind of hope that does not announce itself. It does not arrive with declarations or with certainty. It shows up quietly, in the particular way a door stands open on a morning when it was closed before. In the particular way a chair has been moved from the wall to a place where someone might sit. In the particular way a person's hands move when they have remembered why the moving matters. It is the hope that comes after the long, difficult work of finding out who you are, when you have stopped performing the person you thought you were supposed to be. It is, perhaps, the only kind of hope that lasts. And this, more than anything else, is what this story has been about. Not the falling, which was real, and not the breaking, which was real, but the quiet and particular and entirely unremarkable morning on the other side of all of it, when the light comes through the window and the work is there to be done, and the person beside you knows how to sit in the silence and call it enough.